Hello, this is Martin Gore from Depeche Mode.
Hi, this is Dave Gahan from Depeche Mode, and you are listening to
My Nerd World.
Welcome to it, and I'm your host, Jon Justice. Depeche Mode, the podcast. And thank you so much for checking out the episode once again this week. On the show, where did Memento Mori land on the Album of the Year list, according to Rolling Stone? Now, I don't subscribe to Rolling Stone. I couldn't tell you the last time I picked up a Rolling Stone. However, back in the 90s, that trifecta era of Depeche Mode that I talk about so often on the show, I mean, Rolling Stone was a go-to. And I remember the coverage around Depeche Mode that they did, from Music for the Masses and Violator and Songs of Faith and Devotion, and it was always a big deal whenever Depeche Mode landed in Rolling Stone. It was akin to seeing the band end up on a movie soundtrack or some place beyond where we, the hardcore fans, would typically go and find them. And there was a level of importance to it. I don't put as much importance on it. However, Rolling Stone is still a popular publication and still carries a lot of weight with individuals. So the fact that our beloved Depeche Mode ended up on the list again, or ended up on the list, I think is something of merit. So I'll tell you what they had to say and where they landed on the list. Don't get too excited. I'm just happy that they're actually on the list and continue to get recognition for this amazing album. Also, we're going to spend the bulk of the show talking about you. Essentially kind of a listener appreciation podcast. I have several emails, listener feedback that I want to share, a fan spotlight that I want to get into. So that's going to be the bulk of this episode this week. As always, if you want to email, talkshownerd@gmail.com, talkshownerd@gmail.com. You can also leave a comment up on YouTube if you happen to be listening there. And of course, like and subscribe to the YouTube channel or whatever podcast platform you happen to be listening to this very show on. All right, so let's get into what little news and content that we have. Before I dive into the Rolling Stone 100 Best Albums of 2023 and Depeche Mode Memento Mori's ranking, there isn't much else going on apart from the tour continuing, the band getting ready to wrap up this leg before they take a holiday break and head back overseas. I have not heard anything with regard to the release of those 4 other fully produced tracks that we expected to get before the end of the year, or any sort of additional box set. Strange and Strange 2 comes out in the next few weeks. I've got mine pre-ordered on Blu-ray, but other than that, it's been relatively quiet. So at this point in time, I'm not anticipating that we're going to be getting any more material, released material from the band. We'll see what happens. But things have been awfully quiet, and I haven't heard anything since those initial rumors and reports from a few months back. As I mentioned, though, as I was prepping for the show this week, I did come across this little nugget, the 100 Best Albums of 2023 from Rolling Stone magazine. I won't go through the other list of the bands that are on this 100 Best Albums of 2023. And to be honest with you, I'm not familiar with hardly any of them, including the ones that are surrounding Memento Mori. All of this is to say that on their 100 Best Albums for this year, Memento Mori landed at number 99, which I thought was rather funny. I mean, it wasn't 100, but still, to end up on the list, it's a pretty big deal, all things considered. Rolling Stone isn't as prestigious as it used to be, but it's still cool to see the band get this type of recognition, especially from a publication that has been a part of their career for almost the entirety of their career. This is what they had to say about the album. Melancholy has long been an important part of the Depeche Mode experience. So it's not surprising that the group, whose 2 members are now in their 60s, named their 15th album Memento Mori, a title they picked before the death of founding member Andrew Fletcher. And I was happy to see they got that little detail right. Acknowledging mortality defines much of Memento Mori, but it never feels heavy-handed or even all that sullen. Some of the tracks even sound upbeat. As always with Depeche Mode, everything counts in larger amounts, and on Memento Mori, the stakes feel bigger than ever. writes Rolling Stone. So, nice little blurb and write-up for Memento Mori. And again, nice little acknowledgement for the band as we get ready to close what has been just an incredible year for Depeche Mode fans. Many of you have commented on my Denver trip. I'll get to that with the listener feedback, which was just the absolute highlight of my year, apart from getting the album itself. As a matter of fact, it didn't quite end as Matt, who was so gracious, he and his family, to host me in Denver to go to the show a couple of weeks ago, was kind enough to gift me one of the, I believe, 3 guitar picks that Martin and Peter used on this tour. So I'm working on something very special. My wife's putting something together for me that I can hang and put it up and show. But I've actually got it in my hands right now, and I think that this is the first piece of, and only piece of memorabilia that I have from the band that actually was in their possession, apart from some signed items that I have. So needless to say, this Memento Mori guitar pick I will be certainly cherishing as one of the highlights of this trip that I did, but also just one of the highlights of my collection of Depeche Mode items. So, Matt, as always, man, thank you so much. I really did appreciate that. All right, let's get to your listener feedback this week. We also have a fan spotlight we'll dive into as well. And again, thank you to everybody who writes into the show. It always puts a smile on my face whenever my inbox goes off and I'm hearing from the friends of the Depeche Mode podcast. First comes from David Theofold, who writes, "It's so good to hear that you thought this concert was a success. I definitely believe that it is as good as you say, and no, if it wasn't, you would also say that too. I appreciate you always being honest. I'm going on December 17th with my wife, daughter, and son, which will be my 13th time and a first for them. I couldn't be more excited for this evening, especially for my daughter. She is nuts for music like I am and loves Depeche Mode as well. She's 20 years old. I totally agree with you that I don't think they're done after this album and tour. We all know that what Memento Mori means and know that this band will never die. Their music will live forever. Cheesy, yes, I know, but I had to, LOL. Again, thank you, as always, for keeping us posted on everything and keeping it real. Happy holidays, David Theofold." Thank you, David, and a happy holidays to you and your family. And going back over and watching some of the videos of this tour and the ones from Denver, I mentioned on the podcast last week how there's a bunch of footage where you can see our group from Denver last week. And I felt bad watching the videos, though, because I had on my Doc Martens. I'm already 6'1", so I was like a foot taller than a lot of people, and I hope I wasn't blocking anybody's view. That would really suck. But I was blown away by the crowd reaction. I don't remember. And again, it's always the most recent thing, right? But I don't remember the crowds being like they were those 2 weeks ago in Denver on any of these previous tours. Maybe I'm wrong. I seem to recall when I went to Chicago on the Global Spirit Tour that the crowd seemed somewhat subdued. Now, maybe I'm a bit biased because of where I was positioned in the arena, and perhaps if I was further out in the arena, I would have noticed something different. But I shot video and posted up on my Instagram at the My Nerd World, and on my TikTok at the Jon Justice, Jon, on TikTok. One of the crowd shots before the encore came on, and it was just absolutely incredible. So we'll see. But my point is that I think the band, for being as old as they are, I can't imagine them not being somewhat rejuvenated after this, even in their older age. One more point I wanted to make with regard to the Rolling Stone write-up, a comment they made about the album. There's something that happens for me with new Star Wars content. I'm a massive Star Wars fan. As I've mentioned many times, I have another podcast which is devoted to Star Wars. And oftentimes, the newer content taking place in different Star Wars timelines will reference or have direct through lines to previous content. And for me, it's always a bonus. It enhances the previous Star Wars content that I already love, and it brings more meaning to it, and it makes it takes it to another level. Something very similar happens with me and Depeche Mode, and certainly with Memento Mori as well. Leading up to the concert in Denver, I was just consuming a lot of Depeche Mode and had been listening to entire albums on a whole, which I hadn't done in a while, and certainly this past year as I had been almost exclusively listening to Memento Mori. But going and listening to an album like Music for the Masses or Black Celebration, there's a lot of little references that I've already talked about on the show in and on Memento Mori to other albums, just parts of songs that sound like they were lifted from previous albums. The screech from I Feel You in People Are Good and things of that nature. But I also realized that some of the connections between the albums I hadn't noticed before, and on some of the slower tracks. And I don't know why I had a disconnect on that, but particularly listening to Music for the Masses, I ended up having almost I almost had more appreciation than I already have for Memento Mori, just being reminded of what a Depeche Mode album sounds like as a whole and the way that they ebb and flow. It's not like I'm not familiar with these albums, of course I am, but just spending time listening to them in a different setting leading into the concert, I don't know, it just made me appreciate Memento Mori even more so than I did before. And tracks like Caroline's Monkey, which I enjoy, for some reason I found myself enjoying them more after hearing some of the slower tracks from Music for the Masses. And it might just be a Jon thing for me, but it just gave me an appreciation of the body of work that Depeche Mode does and the consistency of the work that they do, the tempo of the songs, the crafting of the song choices, and Memento Mori just fits in there absolutely with the best of them. All right, I'm done rambling. This was supposed to be a podcast about you, and I made it about me again. Shocking, I know. All right, let's go here. Stephanie Gilbert from Lisbon, New York, which is nowhere near New York City. She writes, says this: I stumbled on your Depeche Mode podcast after attending the Memento Mori concert in Montreal and becoming re-obsessed with the band. After the best concert of my life, I have been looking up and listening to anything Depeche related since. I just listened to your episode about your Denver concert. Hope you weren't achy after the fender bender. No, I wasn't. I have never written to a show or anything like this, but I thought you would appreciate hearing about our experience at the concert. My sister and I are 48 and 50 respectively, and I've been listening to the band since our teens, but hadn't listened to them in a while. But with the wonder of online music, we've been digging up our old favorite bands and listening. So we were excited to listen to the new Depeche Mode album and hear about the tour. The closest place for us to see them was in Montreal, about a 2-hour drive from our home in New York. We were kind of late in getting tickets, so we ended up with nosebleed seats. We got to the Bell Center for doors opening and were directed to our seats by the ushers, continually saying, "Next level up." When we literally climbed to our seats, we were in a section so incredibly high and steep, my sister started having a full-blown panic attack. It was her first. We didn't know she had a crippling fear of heights. I'm a school psychologist, and so I know some strategies and was trying to help her through it, but we ended up having to go back down into the lobby, so we wandered around and bought our merch. I tried to find a spot in an entryway where we might be able to stand and watch the band away from the edge. As the opening act started, one of the ushers came to us and said we couldn't stand there. When we told them why we couldn't use our seats, he took us to his manager. The manager said to follow him, and he would get us some new seats. Maybe it helped that she started crying again, she writes with a smiley face. After he texted someone, he said to follow him, and he took us onto the floor. My sister and I assumed that we were cutting across the arena to the other side, but instead, he made his way up to the front, telling security they're with me. We ended up in the fourth row from the stage. We were awestruck and so incredibly grateful. Amazing. So instead of missing the show, we were totally immersed and had the best seats. We later saw that the seats were worth about $600. Depeche Mode had an amazing concert with so many great songs. David and Martin were beautiful and at their best, putting other 60-year-olds to shame. It's so great to see that they are healthy and aging well. It's actually inspiring. We were in heaven. Other than the really drunk guy in front of us that security kept a close eye on, we experienced the best show we've ever seen. We're still flying high, and I'm completely obsessed with them again. If the next part of their tour wasn't out west or in Europe, I would totally go again. Hopefully you enjoyed the story. I look forward to going back and listening to previous episodes of your podcast. Have a great week, Stephanie. Stephanie, thank you so much for sharing that story. I can only imagine and can imagine what that experience must have been like. And to see that kind of generosity in today's day and age, it almost brings a tear to my eye, especially with this band that we all have such a close connection to. So I can't tell you how pleased I was when I was reading that for the first time, and I shared it with my wife. I'm like, you've got to hear the story. So thank you so much for sharing that with me. You're certainly a friend of the show, as is everybody else who has written in. Jason writes, to the Caped Crusader, in reference to Matt and our Depeche Mode capes. Glad to hear you had a great time at the concert. Judging from the footage online, the guys from the band seem to be enjoying themselves. I've got to wait until January before the Birmingham gig, second night of the next leg. So hopefully they might try a change or two to the set list. And Depeche Mode are the soundtrack to Christmas in the UK, with the upmarket grocery store Waitrose using Just Can't Get Enough for its Christmas TV ad, available on YouTube. Regards, Jason. Thank you, as always, Jason. Chris Culpepper on Twitter writes this: John fans, ! Let's vote. One album you wished DM never made. Chris writes Spirit in parentheses. And most underrated album, Ultra, in parentheses. Cheers. It's hard for me to go one album that you wish DM never made. I mean, if I had to throw an album out, man, that's tough. I mean, I guess I would go Spirit, but I've got a renewed love of that album all of a sudden. So, you know what? I don't have to vote. Most underrated, I would say, Sounds of the Universe. I really do love that album, even though it's got a couple of stinkers on it. But if anybody else wants to chime in on that, feel free. I appreciate the creativity, Chris, and thank you so much for writing in. All right, Michael, friend of the show, writes, decided to reach out through proper channels instead of my usual DM on X. You may have mentioned this on a previous podcast, but I've been curious to know what your top 5 bands are. Obviously, Depeche Mode rules the number 1 spot, but what are the remaining 4? Mine are Depeche Mode, Pet Shop Boys, Erasure, followed by OMD and Aha. Boy, that is such a tough question for me because I have such a wide swath of bands that I love. You know, Pet Shop Boys would be up there. The classics, Duran Duran, would be up there. Erasure, too. I was jamming out on the drive in this morning to Blue Savannah. It popped up on Shuffle as I was driving into work. I love that song. I actually thought it would be a great spaceship name, Blue Savannah. Anyway, I love a lot of OMD as well. I'll have to go recent bands for this one at the moment, the bands that I'm listening to the most. And at the moment, Gunship, I look forward to everything that they've been putting out lately. Churches is another band that I've been looking forward to everything that they have been putting out. If I had to pick so let's see, Depeche Mode, Churches, Gunship, I'm only at 3. I need 2 more. And it's tough, too, when you get older because there's a lot of bands that I'm not as into as I used to be, but they were so fundamental in my musical tastes. Nights are Ebb, Front 242, 9 Inch Nails, The Cure. So you're going to have a rotating list of bands that I enjoy. And it's tough because a lot of the bands that I really love aren't out there putting out music like they used to. So They're sort of a quasi list. You know what? Popple Eat itself is definitely up there. Love Popple Eat itself. Jesus Jones is a band that I absolutely love and still listen to quite a bit as well. So there's a handful of lists that would rotate in terms of the top 5. So there's me skating away from your question without having to commit to an actual top 5. Michael wraps up saying, I hope you had a wonderful holiday, and as always, I look forward to more episodes. Thank you, Michael, for that. Always great to hear from you. All right, and this leads us to a fan spotlight, which we haven't done for quite a long time. And this comes from Amy in Worcestershire. I got it right this time. Worcestershire. I said Worcestershire, like the sauce. Greetings, John, from merry old England. I just wanted to email and wish you an amazing time at the Denver gig. So she wrote this prior to me going to the show. I've been catching up with your fabulous podcast over the last few months and have been getting giddy with excitement with you as the weeks ticked by. I've heard it said DM finds you just when you need it most, and I truly believe that's the case. That said, I can't help feeling a bit of a fraud when it comes to my DM fandom. Being born in 82, the band predate me by a couple of years for a start. Being a teenager in the UK in the 90s meant we only heard big ones on the radio. Just can't get enough. Personal Jesus, Enjoy the Silence. Occasionally we got to hear earlier hits like People Are People, but exposure was limited. I do, however, vividly remember the media interest when Barrel of a Gun was released after the band's difficult period, and many happy times with my good and very cool friend Anita singing along to DM at university in the early 2000s. Usually this was accompanied by her berating me for getting the lyrics horribly wrong. Fast forward to May of 2022, and as I was approaching my 40th birthday in a job that, after 16 years, was driving me crazy and entering a period of deep reflection, a pseudo-midlife crisis, if you will, and then Fletch died. By happy accident, I found myself watching a repeat of the documentary Sith Britannia, followed by Depeche Mode at the BBC late one Saturday night. And I was transfixed. I recognized so many songs. There was just something about these baby-faced Essex boys, particularly Martin with his fluffy hair, that took hold of my heart. I couldn't shake the disease, if you will. As the announcements and buzz around Memento Mori grew, I found myself desperate to make up for lost time. And by the way, I'll stop here really quick, and that's a story that, if you've been listening to the podcast, I've heard over and over again. Something about this album, and maybe it was the passing of Fletch, brought a lot of people back into the fold, which I think is really cool. Honestly, my voyage of discovery with DM this last year or so made me feel like the teenager I never was, as I don't ever recall having been as obsessed with the band growing up as I have been with Depeche Mode. I started off with the hits, YouTube podcast, and learning the band's history. An article or interview would mention a song that I hadn't listened to yet, and I'd open up a wormhole of new levels of discovery and enjoyment. This all reminds me of when I first found Depeche Mode after hearing Shake the Disease and going down that same rabbit hole trying to get my hands on everything that they had released up until that point around music for the masses. That was me there, by the way. Getting back to this. Underpinning it all was Martin lyrics and their impact on this burned-out 40-something. You've talked before about the gift of ambiguity that accompanies DM songs, and it's so true. I've shed tears over Somebody, and Here Is the House. Yes. Thinking about my husband and children and the things must change refrain from Sun and the Rainfall spoke so clearly to me about the job I needed to and have recently changed. Hooray! Good for you. And I felt a runner's high as the sun rose against the soaring chorus of Never Let Me Down Again in my ears. It would be easy to be jealous of the more mature DM fans who have had their joy and privilege of being there from the start. Indeed, I am somewhat envious, bitter even, of having missed out on World Violation, Devotional, and more recent tours, of being on the wrong continent for 101 and being underexposed to DM's output in the 21st century. That said, discovering them now with a bit of life experience behind me, the opportunities to make my own associations with their music and approach their discography with the same freshness that you all did as teenagers and young adults is my own privilege. If you've made it this far, congratulations. My rambling is nearly over. Unfortunately, DM just don't do anything for my hubby, but I've got my ticket for Birmingham, UK in January. Hey, another person going to that show, and I cannot wait. Thanks for taking the time to read this. I just needed to share my excitement with a community who get it and hope you don't mind my newbie status. Absolutely not. Keep up the great work and best wishes to you and all the friends of the show. Now, Amy was kind enough to write in after my last week's podcast and said this: greetings again from Worcestershire. Pretty decent pronunciation last week, by the way. Have a gold star. Thank you. I will gladly take it. I had to hold myself back from emailing yesterday. I've been in London for work, and the UK rail system had let me down again, making my 7-hour round trip more like 9. Imagine my joy then when I saw your latest podcast had landed and could keep me company on the last leg home. And then the name check for the listener spotlight. Well, I'm shivering with excitement. The reason I held back from emailing straight away was that I was reflecting on what you said about Denver. It was heartwarming to hear how much the concert exceeded your expectations, as well as the impact on you of sharing that experience with Matt and his family. I did, however, feel you did yourself an injustice, pun intended. Don't forget the impact that you have on all the friends of the show, me included, in bringing DM to the masses. I doff my cap to you, sir. And I say a hearty thank you for that. I appreciate it. Cannot wait for January and the Birmingham concert now. I may even bring my 25-year-old Doc Martens out of retirement. I bought a brand new pair. I didn't have any anymore, and I actually bought a brand new pair earlier this year, early enough to break them in and wore them my entire trip in honor. Actually, I wear them every day now when I go to work. As my office building looks out directly over the arena in Birmingham City Center, we can usually hear and feel the sound checks when the gigs are on, so I'll have to loiter during my lunch break. That's awesome, when the day finally arrives. It may be my first DM concert, hopefully not my last, but it sounds like I'm in for a treat whenever that happens. Best wishes to you and all the friends of the show, and thanks again for taking the time to reading my ramblings. Kind regards, Amy. Amy, thank you, and thank you so much for the kind words. It has been quite the journey this year. I started this podcast years ago, just shocked that nobody was doing a weekly podcast, and took some time off, as you've probably, if you've gone back and listened to previous episodes, there was a pretty big gap after Spirit. But it has been an absolute pleasure to almost every week get on here and talk about Depeche Mode, and I'm just so thankful to everybody who listens and the generosity of all the friends that I've made here this year. The year's not over yet, though. We got a few more shows before we get to the end of the year. As always, thank you so much for checking out the episode. If this does happen to be one of the first times that you are listening, and you like to read science fiction and want to support my nerd world, I hope you'll check out my science fiction series. For everybody else who's listened to the show and don't want to hear the spiel again, you're free to go, and thanks for listening. But for you newbies, check out EMBARK. It's available on Amazon.com or mynerdworld.net. I wanted to write a story being a fan of George Lucas and a fan of Star Wars before I was a fan of anything, and then becoming a fan of Depeche Mode before I was a fan of any band. I set this story in the future, where air and spaceflight culture has replaced car culture. Inspired in part by Depeche Mode, life in the so-called space age, the world we live in, and life in general, Depeche Mode does play a large part in the underlying themes of the story. Love and loss. The main character himself is actually a massive Depeche Mode fan set in the future at a time when the music of this era is nostalgic and popular among the characters of the stories. And they do feature references to Depeche Mode, both direct and indirect, while telling an exciting sci-fi space opera saga spread out over 7 books. Book 1, and the description is as follows. Taft has found something, and humanity won't survive without it. The only thing that matters to Taft Guardia as much as his ship is fellow pilot Keith Amaro. He'll need both to survive when an industrial accident inside a Deep Corp civilian and military spacecraft factory sets off a catastrophic chain of events. Unaware of the disaster, Keitha suddenly receives a cryptic message from her late aerospace engineer father, leading them to a shocking discovery. When the ruthless Synargum of D-Corp attempts to seize control, Taft realizes what they've found may be the only hope of saving Earth's evacuees. But first, he'll have to help solve the mystery of Keitha's past, or risk losing her and everything he holds dear. If you like your science fiction to be epic, with some romance and action, EMBARK is perfect for you. Written for adults, but it's great for ages 11 plus. Think Star Wars just in terms of the themes. There's no language or anything explicit. Pick up EMBARK Book 1 today. 7 books in all in the series, all of them available in hardcover, paperback, ebook, and audiobook. And you can actually order hardcover and paperbacks directly from me. All you got to do is email talkshownerd@gmail.com, and I'll give you instructions. And I'll get them signed for you, and I usually get them out within a few days and to you in a week. If you're looking to purchase them overseas, it's best to go through Amazon to do that, just because the price of shipping overseas. But if you're here in the States, shipping is $5 flat across the board, regardless of how many books you order. So again, just email me, talkshownerd@gmail.com, if you want a paperback or hardcover of any of the 7 books in the series. Amazon.com, search for Jon, Jon Justice, and EMBARK, or just go to mynerdworld.net, and there's links right there on the homepage. Thank you so much for checking out this episode. I'll be back again next week. In the meantime, I hope wherever you are, you're happy, you're healthy, and you're safe. We'll talk to you then. Bye.